Welcome to Refuting Rationality, the show where I refute the YouTube atheist Rationality Rules. In today's episode, Mr. Rationality is gonna throw logic out the window in order to try and take on the unmoved mover. Let's begin.
In the interest of keeping this video relevant, I'm going to address Cray's specific rendition of the unmoved mover, rather than Aquinas's, because while the two differ in the language and references that they use, they are nevertheless fundamentally the same. And so, here's Craft presenting the argument.
The argument starts with the not very startling observation that things move. But nothing moves for no reason. Something must cause that movement. And whatever caused that must be caused by something else, and so on. But this causal chain cannot go backwards forever. It must have a beginning. There must be an unmoved mover to begin all the motion in the universe, a first domino to start the whole chain moving, since mere matter never moves itself.
So, straight from the outset, I want to point out two absolutely devastating flaws.
Stop, don't.
The first is that even if we accept every premise of Craft's presentation of this argument, all this would prove is that an unmoved mover existed, and that's it. Seriously, that's all it would prove. It would not prove that this unmoved mover still exists, that it's a being, that it's conscious, or that it impregnated a virgin in order to sacrifice itself to itself so it could forgive you for your ancestors' actions. Or in other words, it would not prove that Craft's very specific interpretation of Christianity is true.
Classic Rationality Rules, trying to make mountains out of molehills, expecting one argument to cover every circumstance. And it's funny that he acts like it's such a big deal. Now, as for not proving that the unmoved mover still exists, let's think about that logically for just a second. The unmoved mover would necessarily have existed for all eternity past, before time existed. So there is no reason to assume that this unmoved mover could not continue to exist for all eternity. And of course, a first cause of everything would not be subject to anything. In other words, nothing would be able to kill the unmoved mover, because anything created by the unmoved mover would necessarily be lesser than the unmoved mover. Next, he says the argument wouldn't prove that the unmoved mover is a being. Well, since the unmoved mover existed before time, it couldn't have accidentally created everything. In order to act outside of time, you need to choose to do so, and only beings can make choices. After proving it's a being, proving it's conscious seems kind of redundant. Also, Jesus does not forgive us for Adam's sin. He forgives us for our own sin. But again, to reiterate, and I'm sure it won't be the last time I have to make this point with Rationality Rules, this argument by itself does not need to prove a specific God.
The second game-ending flaw with this argument is that premise 3, the assertion that something must have existed without a cause, is an obvious case of special pleading. A special pleading fallacy occurs when a proponent creates an exception to a rule without adequate justification, and that is precisely what premise 3 is doing. It is literally asserting that premise 2, the assertion that everything in motion is caused to be in motion by something else, applies to absolutely everything except for the cause of the universe, without adequately justifying why. In fact, by itself, the argument doesn't even attempt to substantiate this assertion, it just makes it.
That assertion was justified. It was justified in the voice clip that Rationality Rules presented. You cannot have a chain of causal events going back for all eternity. I would love to see Mr. Rationality's justification for the existence of an infinite regression, because if you don't have an unmoved mover, that's what you have, an infinite regression, which is not logically possible.
And this brings us perfectly to the crux of Craft's faulty reasoning. In his attempt to prove that an unmoved mover does indeed exist, he offers us two additional faulty arguments. The first is the assertion that
we now know that all matter, that is, the whole universe, came into existence some 13.7 billion years ago, and it's been expanding and cooling ever since.
Now you might be thinking, surely this assertion is true, isn't it? I mean, I've heard many well-respected scientists saying the same, haven't I? Well, the answer is that it depends. It depends on what definition of the word universe is being used. Allow me to explain. If we are using the scientific definition of the universe, that being all matter, space and time, then yes, it is accurate to say that the Big Bang was the beginning of the universe. But if we are using the colloquial definition of the universe, that being everything that exists, everything that has existed, and everything that will exist, then no, it is inaccurate to say that the Big Bang was the beginning of the universe. Hence, because Kraft uses the scientific definition of the universe for the conclusion of this additional argument, but he uses the colloquial definition of the universe for the conclusion of his main argument, he therefore commits an equivocation fallacy, and hence his argument
All space, time, and matter would necessarily be counted with everything that exists, has existed, and will exist. So it's not that he's equivocating, he's just bringing in a magnifying glass and focusing in on one portion. And he's even doing it within your worldview. Also, although it can be hard to know exactly what Rationality Rules beliefs are, I think it's a safe assumption that he's a naturalist and or a materialist, in which case all space, time, and matter would be everything that existed, has existed, and will exist. But of course, the cause of space, time, and matter cannot also be made of space, time, and matter, so being a naturalist and or materialist would be irrational. But I think the biggest problem with this accusation of equivocation is that the additional argument is taken out of context.
And the second faulty argument that Kraft presents is the assertion that
Because Einstein's general theory of relativity says that all time is relative to matter, and since all matter began 13.7 billion years ago, so did all time. So there's no time before the Big Bang.
Now you might again be thinking, surely this one is correct, isn't it? But again, you'd be wrong. It's a false premise. To quote Sean Carroll, my all-time favourite theoretical physicist,
So a lot of cosmologists will say there was a beginning. And the problem with this is that the prediction that there's a beginning, or the understanding that there's a beginning, is based on general relativity, and we know general relativity is not right. The reason we know it's not right is because, for one thing, it is not compatible with quantum mechanics. So basically, we have a prediction that the universe began based on a theory we have no right to trust.
and hence, to quote Carroll again, the correct thing to say about the Big Bang is not that there was no time before it, but rather that our current understanding of the laws of physics give out at that moment in time. Or to put this in another way, just as Newton's law of universal gravitation functions perfectly when applied to our everyday lives, but fails when applied to celestial bodies, Einstein's general theory of relativity functions perfectly when applied to our everyday lives and celestial bodies, but it fails when applied to the Big Bang. Hence, when it comes to the question of what existed before the Big Bang, the real answer is we don't know. And to add "therefore God" to the end of this would be a classical argument from ignorance, which, indeed, is unfortunately exactly what many proponents of the unmoved mover do.
I find it curious that when he was comparing Newton's law of gravitation with Einstein's law of relativity, or theory of relativity, one would expect that from the previous quote from the guy whose name I've already forgotten, he would have put in that last line, does not function correctly when applied to quantum mechanics. Instead, he says when applied to the Big Bang. Sounds like somebody's begging the question. The guy he quotes says general relativity is not right because it is not compatible with quantum mechanics. How about instead I say quantum mechanics aren't right because they are not compatible with general relativity? And I think I know why Rationality Rules likes this guy. He wants a theory for everything, just like Rationality Rules wants a single argument for everything. His statements do not prove relativity wrong. Space and time are still interlinked. They are two sides of the same coin. Understanding for the laws of physics gives out at the moment of creation because there was no law of physics yet, and there was no time, or space, or matter. He says he doesn't know what was before the Big Bang, but if he just applied some logical reasoning, he would at least know that there was something before the universe, something which was eternal, is eternal. Because eternity doesn't stop, and that something had to make a choice to create the universe. And you can use whichever definition of universe you like, it would still apply.